In September of 1931, a fishing trawler called the Colinda was working the shallow water of the Leman and Ower banks, off the coast of Norfolk. The skipper was a man named Pilgrim Lockwood. He hauled the net up from about 120 feet and found it heavy with something that was not fish. It was peat, a dark, fibrous block of old bog dragged up whole from the floor of the North Sea. When one of the crew broke it open to clear the net, there was an object inside it, a harpoon, a barbed point, nearly 6 inches long, carved from red deer antler, with 17 teeth cut carefully along one edge. It had been made by a human being. It had been made on dry land, and the nearest dry land was under 60 feet of cold salt water, and had been for thousands of years. The point went to Cambridge, and in 1932, the archaeologist Miles Burkitt published it in the journal Man. He understood what it meant, because the idea was already in the air. Almost 20 years earlier, a geologist named Clement Reid had written a small, strange book called Submerged Forests, arguing from tree stumps and peat that the floor of the North Sea had once been a living land. The harpoon was the proof in the hand. The sea floor out there was not a sea floor. It had been a country, not a bridge, a homeland. For most of the last century, we called that country a land bridge, a strip of ground people crossed to get somewhere better. From the continent to Britain, a corridor with nobody living in it, useful only as a way across. That framing was the mistake, and it lasted decades. The harpoon in the peat was not dropped by someone passing through. It was lost by someone who lived there, hunting an animal that lived there too, on a morning that must have felt as permanent as any of ours feel to us. This is the story of that country. It has a name now. It was the size of a nation. And the strangest thing about it is not that it drowned, it is how it drowned, because the dramatic version, the one almost everyone tells, the one with a single great wave on a single terrible day, turns out to be the wrong story. To see why, we have to build the country back up before we watch it go under. Number 5. The country we drew in sound. The land had a name before it had a proper map, and we owe the name to one person. In 1998, the archaeologist Bryony Coles published a paper in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society. She took the flat, dismissive phrase everyone had been using, the land bridge, and she refused it. A bridge is a thing one crosses and leaves. This was a place people stopped and lived and were buried. She argued that the whole drowned expanse deserved to be treated as a landscape in its own right, with rivers and coasts and seasons, and she gave it a name borrowed from the sandbank the fishermen already worked. She called it Doggerland. It was a small act of respect, disguised as a naming convention, and it quietly changed the questions people were willing to ask. Nobody asks who once lived on a bridge. About a country. The question is unavoidable. Naming it was the easy part. Seeing it was much harder, because Doggerland lies under an average of 100 feet of the busiest sea in the world, buried beneath a century of shifting sediment. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place, the oil and gas industry. For decades, energy companies had been firing pulses of sound down through the North Sea and listening to the echoes, mapping the rock layers below in the search for deposits. Those same echoes had quietly recorded, in faint gray lines, the shape of the land as it was before the water rose over it. A team led by Vincent Gaffney at the University of Bradford understood that archaeology was sitting inside a mountain of data that had been gathered for something else entirely and never read for this. So they read it. And out of the noise a country came up, rivers with tributaries and floodplains, a great winding waterway they nicknamed the Schotten River. Ridges and hills, salt marsh, the pale outline of an enormous freshwater lake. The first survey, the North Sea Paleo Landscapes Project, mapped around 23,000 square kilometers of this lost world. The project that followed, aptly named Europe's Lost Frontiers, would go on to map something on the order of 185,000 square kilometers. The most complete reconstruction of a drowned landscape anywhere on the planet. Where earlier generations had a vague gray blank between Britain and Denmark, we now have river systems detailed enough to trace by hand, and a coastline that once wrapped around a lake bigger than many modern counties. But here is the honest limit of that triumph, and it matters for everything that follows. What the sound gives back is terrain. The valley, the riverbank, the lakeshore, the coast. It does not give back the camp that stood on the riverbank or the family inside the camp. We had recovered the stage, in extraordinary detail, and almost none of the play. The map has no people, which is exactly why the handful of things the sea has physically handed back carry so much weight. That brings us to what keeps coming up in the nets. Number 4. What the water gave back. Return to the Colinda harpoon for a moment because its story did not end in 1932. For over half a century, the point sat in a museum in Norwich, catalogued roughly as ancient. Then in 1988, it was radiocarbon dated directly, and the number that came back reset the whole picture. It was close to 12,000 years before the modern era, older than farming, older than pottery, deep in the old Stone Age. This was not a stray thing dropped at the edge of history. It was among the first direct proof of human beings living far out on the North Sea plain in a world of Ice Age animals. A single dated object cannot tell us how many people were out there or whether the harpoon was lost by a lone traveler or a settled community. It tells us only that the plain was not empty. That, at the time, was enough to overturn a century of assuming it was, and it was never alone. For as long as trawlers have dragged the Dogger Bank, their nets have come up with bones, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, giant deer, the fauna of a cold open steppe. The fishermen even had a word for the dark peat that surfaced with the bones. They called it moorlog. For 100 years, working crews were dredging up the furniture of a lost world and, more often than not, shoveling it back over the side because there was nowhere for it to go and no one asking for it. The most careful modern look came only recently. A team, including Vincent Gaffney, working with Belgian and Dutch researchers, went out to a feature called the Brown Bank, a long ridge about 50 kilometers off the English coast, and put divers and coring gear down onto it. Some 32 meters beneath the waves, they found a fossil forest, tree roots still standing in the ground where they had grown, the tiny shells of land snails, a thick bed of peat, and worked in among it, two small objects that changed the character of the place completely: a struck flint flake and part of a broken hammerstone, both shaped unmistakably by human hands, a tool and no house. That is the precise shape of the Doggerland problem. Almost everything the drowned country gives us arrives torn out of its context, snagged by a net, sucked up in a core tube, with no way to set it back down in the landscape it belonged to. We can hold a hunter's flint in one hand and a beautiful detailed map of the terrain in the other, and we cannot lay the first onto the second. We know now beyond doubt that people were out there. We almost never know exactly where any one of them stood. The evidence is real, and the evidence is orphaned, both at once. So when a story comes along that promises a single dramatic ending to all of it, a clean and terrible last day, a moment you can point to, it is very human to want that story to be true. And for a long time, we had one, and it was a good one. Number 3. The wave we all agreed on. Off the west coast of Norway, the continental shelf drops away into deep Atlantic water, and around 8,000 years ago, a section of that underwater slope, a piece of seafloor the size of a small country, let go. It is called the Storegga slide, and it is one of the largest submarine landslides known anywhere on Earth, hundreds of kilometers of sediment collapsing into the deep, possibly over just a few hours. An avalanche on that scale does one thing above all others: it displaces a colossal volume of water. It makes a tsunami. The wave itself is not in dispute. Its signature is written into the coastlines of the north, in Scotland and along the Norwegian shore, as a sheet of marine sand shoved improbably far inland and buried in the peat, sitting high above where any storm or ordinary tide could ever reach. Geologists began recognizing those deposits back in the 1980s, and once it is clear that a wave of that magnitude swept across the North Sea at the exact time Doggerland was in its final centuries, the conclusion seems to write itself. In 2008, a team led by Bernhard Wenninger set that conclusion down formally in the journal Documenta Prehistorica. They modeled the Storegga event as the catastrophic final flooding of Doggerland, and described, in their words, a catastrophic impact on the coastal Mesolithic population. A single afternoon that drowned the last of a country and the people standing on its shore. It is a genuinely powerful image, and it did what powerful images do. It went into the textbooks, into the documentaries, into more or less every account of Doggerland ever made for the public, including, for years, the account this channel would have given you. The wave was easy to teach because it had everything a story wants: a place, a moment, a before and an after, and a villain the size of the ocean. The slow version had none of those things. So the slow version lost, one wave to end a world. But a model is an argument, not a witness. Wenninger's reconstruction rested on a specific assumption that the high ground of Doggerland, the Dogger Bank itself, was still above the sea and still full of people when the wave arrived. If that were true, a great wave breaking over a crowded island really would be an ending, and that single assumption is exactly the place where the whole comfortable story begins to crack. Because in the years after the model was published, researchers stopped arguing about the wave in theory and went looking for it in fact, down in the mud of Doggerland, where if it had really done what the story said, it would surely have left its mark. Number 2. Finding the wave in the ground. In 2018, as part of the Europe's Lost Frontiers project, a research vessel lowered a long coring tube into the seabed above a set of drowned river channels near a feature called the Outer Dowsing Deep in the southern North Sea. The team was not, at first, chasing the tsunami at all. They were sampling the buried rivers for pollen, for sediment, for ancient genetic material, trying to reconstruct the living, breathing landscape, the plants and the water and the seasons, and in one core, running up through the calm, ordinary layers of an old river valley, they hit something violent, a layer of broken shell, coarse rubble, and stones dumped all at once in a single chaotic event, sitting exactly where no slow, gentle river would ever have placed it. It was the geological handwriting of a surge of water strong enough to rip up the seabed and drop it somewhere new. When James Walker, Vincent Gaffney, and their colleagues published the full analysis in the journal Antiquity in 2020, they were able to say something no one had been able to say before. This was the first physical trace of the Storegga tsunami ever recovered from the southern North Sea, from the drowned heart of Doggerland itself, and not just its distant northern edges. There it was. The wave, after nearly a century of harpoons and nets and catastrophes and models, here at last was the event itself, recorded in the sediment of the place where it struck. And this is where the discipline of the thing shows, because the same researchers who found it were the ones most careful about what it did and did not prove. A tsunami, they noted, needs a run-up of only about a meter to kill a person, yet often needs more than 5 meters to leave any lasting layer in the ground at all. So the absence of tsunami deposits across most of the region proves almost nothing. A wave can do terrible harm and leave no fossil of itself behind. Worse for the tidy story, the Storegga event landed in the middle of a known climate downturn, a sharp cold snap that gripped the northern world around the same few centuries, which makes it genuinely difficult to separate the damage done by the water from the damage done by the weather. The team laid all of this out in the open, in the paper itself. But the cores did something far more important than confirming the wave. They kept on recording, layer by layer, what happened after it. And what happened after it is the reason this entire story has to be told again, from the other end. Number 1, it was not the wave. Here's the moment the whole picture turns over. In those same cores, in the layers lying directly on top of the chaos of the tsunami debris, the researchers did not find an ending. They found the land coming back. The ancient genetic material in the sediment, read together with the layers stacked above the flood deposit, described floodwaters draining away and the ground quietly recovering. Freshwater plants and land species returning to that stretch of Doggerland. The Dogger littoral after the wave had rolled through and gone, the tsunami hit. And then, in that place, ordinary life simply resumed. Sit with what that means, because it inverts everything. The single great wave, the clean and terrible last day we built the whole legend around, did not end Doggerland. It swept across a landscape that was already, by then, mostly drowned. And the part of it that was left alive survived the wave and carried on. Other researchers had been arriving at the same doorway from a different direction. When John Hill and his colleagues modeled the Storegga tsunami in fine detail, they concluded that even a maximum flood would have covered only around a third of the exposed land, something closer to an unusually high tide than to an extinction event. The catastrophe was real and it was survivable, and Doggerland outlived it, because the land was already disappearing anyway for a reason with no drama in it at all. Between roughly 8,400 and 8,200 years ago, the sea rose somewhere between 1 and 4 meters. Not in an afternoon. Across 2 full centuries, Doggerland was not knocked down. It was flooded out from underneath, one waterline at a time, until the hills broke apart into a scatter of islands that the researchers now call the Dogger Archipelago, and then those islands shrank to a single stubborn bank, and then that bank went under too, becoming, in the end, the sandbank where, thousands of years later, a trawler would snag a block of peat with a harpoon inside it. So the true ending of Doggerland is not a wave. It is a tide that came in and never went back out. And this is where it stops being only about them. You were never meant to picture one bad morning on Doggerland. You were meant to picture 10,000 ordinary ones, a shoreline creeping inland, a little faster than a person could notice across a single lifetime, a good fishing spot that was open water by the time a child had grown, a whole country leaving, not in a scream, but at the unbearable, invisible pace of a rising tide. That is how a homeland actually disappears. slowly enough that no single day is ever the day it ended, so that no one alive on it ever quite understands that the ending is already happening to them. The researchers, to their real credit, put a question mark at the end of the title of their own paper. They are not claiming to have closed the case. Storegga still happened. It's still somewhere killed. What they are questioning is not the wave, but the blame. Whether one dramatic event should be handed the entire story. When the sediment says the water was already winning long before the wave arrived and long after it left, a careful viewer should hold the wave loosely. It was real. It simply was not the murderer we made it into. Number 1 is the longest part of this story on purpose, because the correction matters more than the legend did, which leaves us with a harder, quieter idea to carry out of all of it. We reach for the wave because a single villain is so much easier to hold than the truth. The truth is that Doggerland was not destroyed by anything. It was outlasted by water that rose so patiently that the people living on it almost certainly never knew they were living at the end of anything at all. There was no final generation that understood itself as the final one. Each generation simply found the fishing a little further out than their parents had described, the old family camps a little wetter, the horizon a little nearer, and they adjusted and carried on, the way people always do, until one day there was nothing left to adjust to. That is why the harpoon in the peat is the truest thing this drowned country ever gave us. It is not wreckage from a disaster. It is an ordinary tool dropped on an ordinary day in a place that simply eventually became sea. And the reason it should hold our attention is not that it is far away and long ago. It is that it is not. On every coast we live on today, the water is doing the same slow, patient thing it did to Doggerland. And we too keep scanning the horizon for a single wave to blame when the real story then and now is written one waterline at a time. Not a wave, a waterline. We are the ones still holding the harpoon, standing on a shore, in the middle of the same sentence, trying to read a whole country out of a broken piece of peat. If you want to see more of what the record keeps hidden, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.